So it's also a great pleasure also for me to welcome you in Trento, and I'm very happy to introduce with a couple of words and to introduce your work with a couple of words. So as said, you are a professor of philosophy at Lancaster University, and you have published extensively on feminist philosophy, post-Kantian continental philosophy, aesthetics, and the history of women philosophers. So your first book, as already mentioned, is Petrified Intelligence, that had a groundbreaking role in the interpretation of Hegel. I think it was one of the first books on the philosophy of nature by Hegel, in fact. And after that, you worked extensively on feminist philosophy. One of the most important, maybe, it's Being Born, Birth and Philosophy, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. And then you dedicated a lot of your time to the history of women philosophers. And I would like to highlight your role and the importance of your researches for the rediscovery of women philosophers. On one side, the women philosophers in the German tradition, so in idealism and romanticism. And in the last years, you dedicated yourself to the women philosophers of Britain. So I recall here only women philosophers in 18th century Britain that has been published by Oxford University Press in 2022. And also the importance of the edition you edited of the works by Frances Power Cobb that you edited for Oxford University Press. And I think part of the lecture will be on this figure, on Cobb. So I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Okay, that sounds better. Okay, so I shall try to be in charge of scrolling through the handout at the same time. So it's a bit of an experiment in not using PowerPoint, just for a change. So we will see how it goes. And thank you all for sitting near the front, because so often that these things, people will occupy the two back rows. So this is very nice. I am going to speak today mainly about Cobb and a little bit about two other figures. So Frances Power Cobb, she was a very well-known moral and religious philosopher in Victorian Britain, and she published very extensively. At the time, she was an interlocutor of people that we remember, for instance, Darwin, as I'll talk about, also John Stuart Mill. And quite a bit of her philosophy had a political orientation, and it tied in with the political campaigns with which she was involved, feminist campaigning, but above all for her, for animal welfare. So she was basically the leader of the movement against animal experimentation, or vivisection, as it was called at the time. And so she was at the center of this very large debate about vivisection. I was mentioning to people over lunch that this was such a big issue that there were riots in the streets of London about it. So by the early 1900s, it was huge. I'm going to talk about the philosophical basis of Cobb's animal campaigns, and I'm going to focus, in fact, because she wrote a lot over many, many years, I'm just going to focus on one piece, which is her very first essay about animal ethics, called The Rights of Man and the Claims of Brutes. And so it's got, in this piece, she makes the case for duties to animals from several different perspectives, from three different angles, as I'll put it. So just making sure that you can all see this. And so I'll set out her arguments, and that will lead me into her disagreement with Darwin, because she wanted a lot more, she wanted much more stringent regulation of vivisection than Darwin did. And they basically became the two central opposing forces in the battle about bringing in protective legislation of animals. And then finally, I will comment a little bit on two other Victorian women who wrote about animal ethics, namely Anna Kingsford and Annie Besant, because there were lots of other people besides Cobb, including lots of other women. So I'll try to get those two other figures in as well. But start with the rights of man and the claims of brutes. And I should mention here, of course, that Cobb uses the language of man. Nobody at the time that I've seen seems to have questioned that. She also uses the word brutes. That she did go on to comment on the fact that the language of brutes was problematic, kind of conveying a pejorative view of animals. But here, anyway, she just uses it to mean animals. So this article originally appeared in 1863 in a journal called Fraser's Magazine. And so to give you a sense of Fraser's Magazine, this was where John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism also appeared in the same year, because that was initially serialized. So, you know, it was a central place. And Cobb was provoked to start thinking about animal ethics, because she had read press coverage about what was happening in a veterinary training college in Paris, where people were practicing surgery on live horses without using anesthetics. And Cobb wrote about this. The operations on horses lasted 8 hours, and the aspect of the mangled creatures, hoofless, eyeless, burned, gashed, eviscerated, skinned, mutilated in every conceivable way, appalled the visitors, while it was a subject of merriment to the students. That sort of gives you a sense of the kind of flavor of her writing. And she concluded that there was a need to work out our moral responsibilities to animals and the limits of legitimate experimentation before these practices became more widespread in Britain, which was beginning to happen then. So she sort of wanted to get the legislative limits in at the start. So she's got these 3 angles, I think, just kind of coming at the audience from as many directions as possible. A kind of comparative cultural angle, and what we might see as a more strictly philosophical angle, and a religious Christian angle. So on the comparative point, she contrasts these tortures that are currently being inflicted on horses in this training college. She contrasts this with the injunction to care for animals that she finds in the Islamic tradition, in the Quran and the Hadiths. And she sort of draws together several passages from the Quran and a Hadith in which Muhammad gives water to a thirsty dog, to put them together into this sort of how God has saved only one man out of all of the people of a corrupt and luxurious city. He only saved one man because that man showed mercy to a hungry camel. In contrast, in modern Paris, the trainee vets are getting certificates for their skill in inflicting tortures on horses, as she has it. And so she says, we do not seem to have advanced much over the Muslim by our 18 centuries of Christianity. So, of course, she's trying to shame her contemporaries they thought they were more advanced than the Islamic world. And she was saying, well, it doesn't seem so, at least not in this respect. Now, of course, we might say, well, this attempt to shame her contemporaries relies on the same assumption of superiority, that they've only got reason to be ashamed if the expectation is that they ought to be better than Muslims. But, you know, more charitably, we could say that she's trading on this assumption of European superiority, kind of trying to use it in the service of concern for animals. And she certainly thinks that Europeans, at least, shouldn't be aspiring to be morally worse than other cultural regions of the world. So anyway, then we come to her philosophical argument proper. So here she says that we have a fundamental duty of benevolence. This is sort of a part of her moral philosophy generally. So the duty of benevolence, she says, is that ultimate ground of moral obligation on whose broad basis stand our duties to all living beings. If any creature be sentient, i.e. capable of suffering pain or enjoying pleasure, it is cause sufficient why we should refrain from inflicting pain and should bestow on it pleasure when we may. Now, she doesn't distinguish here between happiness and pleasure, or unhappiness and pain. It's pleasure, happiness for her at this point are the same thing and common to all living beings. So she's distancing herself from the idea that humans can feel happiness, but animals can only ever feel pleasure, so that human happiness counts for more. She's putting the pleasure or happiness of all sentient beings on a level to begin with. Now, you might think this looks very similar to Bentham's principle of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, especially as he included animals, saying the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And Cobb does say he got that right, and that this was an important feature of Bentham's thought, but she said he was only actually restating a duty to all sentient beings that had already been recognized by non-utilitarians. So she thinks utilitarians have no monopoly on the idea of a duty of benevolence to animals and other living beings. Now, having said, however, that there is this duty of benevolence, she then qualifies it, saying there are practical limits, but we can't help everyone all the time. And so she says, given that there have to be some limits, it's right that we should put first those who are near and dear to us over strangers. So that she calls that the principle of precedency of benevolence. So, for instance, if my child and a stranger were both on a sinking boat and I can only save one of them, it would be wrong to save the stranger rather than my own child. So having got that, she then says that we have also, other things being equal, to prioritize human pleasure or happiness over those of animals. So this is where she may seem to be completely going back on herself. She isn't, in fact, but she does say that other human beings have precedency of benevolence. Now, given that she's just been saying that we should prioritize those who are nearest to us, we might think that she thinks the priority of human beings is because we're all the same species. But actually, it's not that for her. The key thing is that she says human beings are moral agents and animals are not. So this is where she says the claims of the brutes on us for happiness must necessarily be subordinated to human claims for happiness. As all the interests of man touch upon moral grounds, they assume higher importance than those of unmoral beings. So this is, especially in the way she puts it when she says, an absolute subordination between the claims of the animal and those of man. This may seem surprising, given that she's basically arguing here for animal rights. And I find that people often object to this part of her views, kind of saying that she's just accepted the idea of human superiority, of humans as exceptional, anthropocentrism, and so on. But Cobb's reply to these objections is that we can only have duties to animals, or indeed any duties at all, because we're moral agents. And since we are moral agents, that does set us apart from animals, inevitably. So to use a later piece of terminology, animals are they're only moral patients, not moral agents. Or as Cobb puts it, they are sentient only, whereas she says humans are more than sentient and also rational and moral beings. So for her, the very same thing that makes us superior, our moral agency, also accounts for our having duties to promote animal happiness. We can only have those duties by virtue of being superior to animals. And conversely, to see ourselves just as one species of animal amongst others, for her, would entail that, like other animals, we don't have any moral obligations, including obligations to animals, so that we would in fact be legitimated in treating other animals however we want, without any moral restraints. And that was basically what she thought was the upshot of Darwinism. So she thought that it was Darwin's view that we're just one species of animals like others, and therefore all we can do is pursue the interests of our species, the greater flourishing, health, power of our species. There are no moral constraints. And that was a view that she thought was becoming widespread in the world around her, as animal experimentation was becoming normalized, and normalized within science, so that she thought there was a kind of a necessary link amongst the rise of science and evolutionary theory, because of course Darwin had published The Origin of Species just recently in 1859. So science, animal experimentation, Darwinism, the idea that humans are merely one species amongst others, they all went together for Cobb. So that once scientists embraced the idea that we're just animals, they would conclude that we're free to act on our instincts, on our self-interest. Just as a lion is free to predate on an antelope, we are free to torture an animal in a scientific experiment, for her. So for her, recognizing human superiority and duties to animals, they had to go together, while denying human superiority and denying duties to animals also went together. So anyway, to go back to her argument, because of this precedency of our claims for benevolence over those of animals, it does follow for her that we may, in some cases, harm animals if doing so is necessary for human happiness. And that now may seem to take away sort of the ground she's just been working towards, because you might say, well, doesn't that imply that it may be okay even to do painful animal experiments if that increases human happiness, given that human happiness has the prior claim? But the way that Cobb avoids that conclusion is that she says that although we may harm animals, if it's necessary to do so to satisfy real human wants, she says we can't legitimately harm animals to satisfy what she calls mere wantonness, which is kind of trivial or unimportant or sort of unworthy desires. So when I tried to think of an example, suppose you're driving along at night and an animal runs out into the road. So if you can't stop or swerve without risk of serious injury to yourself, then she would say it's legitimate to hit the animal. But if you can easily avoid the animal at no risk to yourself, then that's what you must do. But to kind of deliberately run into the animal, if you could avoid it, that would be sort of acting wantonly for her. Now, this language of wanton isn't necessarily helpful. I'm sure she thought it sounded, it sounded rhetorically nice. I think it would have maybe been better to put this in terms of needs and desires, so that we may harm animals if it's, if this is a question of our needs, but not for the sake of mere desires. The basic contrast she is trying to make is between actions where we inflict suffering on animals gratuitously and needlessly, on the one hand, and those cases where it's unfortunately necessary, on the other, because otherwise you would suffer serious deprivation yourself. So the upshot of this is that we're only permitted to harm animals if this is really necessary to prevent human suffering, sort of significant human suffering. And although human wants take precedence over animal wants or needs, if we put it that way, animal wants take precedence over human wantonness. Or if we put it in terms of needs and desires, human needs take precedence over animal needs, but animal needs take precedence over mere human wants. And one of the other aspects of this for her is that the lesser claimants, they still have a claim. So it's not that animals don't have any claim on us at all. Although the human claims sort of come first, nonetheless, as long as we've already met the claims made on us by human beings as other moral agents, then the claims of animals come into the field. So with all of this groundwork in place, Cobb finally draws out what she thinks follows for vivisection, which is that we may harm animals in scientific experiments if this is necessary, she says, for discovering important truths or teaching these truths to other people. But a vivisection, you cannot perform it if it has no clear purpose in terms of answering some specific question, or if it's just to investigate something trivial, or it can't be done if students could learn about this topic without any experimental demonstrations. It's also illegitimate to keep performing the same experiments again and again for teaching purposes. Sort of once is enough per cohort of students. Now, what counts as trivial is going to be one of the tricky things here, because she says vivisections can't be done to discover trivial truths. So one of the examples she brought out again and again was Claude Bernard's experiment heating rabbits in ovens to find out the exact temperature at which they would die, which she thought was trivial. His self-defense was that he was investigating thermoregulation. Yeah, I mean, Cobb would still have said, well, surely you could have investigated it some other way. Most crucially of all, in all these limitations on vivisection, animals may only be made to suffer pain if their feeling pain is itself necessary for the experiment. And so she conceded that that could be the case if scientists were studying our pain responses. But otherwise, anesthetics must always be used. And this might sound, you know, she's gone through all this in order to establish something so self-evident. And she did say herself, you know, yeah, this ought to be so obvious as to go without saying. But it wasn't. It was very, very controversial. I don't really understand why, but there seemed to be many scientists and medical practitioners at the time who were reluctant to use anesthetics, who didn't think they needed to. Magendie, who had been the mentor of Claude Bernard, for instance, he had disdained using anesthetics. He kind of looked down on it. And he seemed almost to take a delight in being able to kind of hurt animals. And so this was the sort of thing that Cobb was counting as wanton. You know, anesthetics could have been used. They were available. People were just deliberately choosing not to. The final angle that she has is the Christian one. And so this is really a very simple point, that the animals are part of God's creation. Because Cobb was a Christian herself. The animals are part of God's creation. He's made them capable of happiness, and God's good. So he would not have created animals intending them to lead lives of suffering. Now, the accidental byproduct of the ways that they depend on one another is that some of them do inflict suffering on the others. But Cobb saw that things like predation as sort of part of an interconnected system where each kind of animal can thrive, and God's purpose is for them to thrive as much as they can, sort of within the interspecies constraints. So she says he didn't make the animals merely to be destroyed or damaged or kind of discarded by human beings. And we're doing God's will if we help animals to be as happy as they can be. And we shouldn't be violating his purposes. And this is where Cobb says, he, the good one, has made them to be happy, but leaves us our awful gift of freedom to use or to misuse towards them. Now, this aspect of her argument, of course, was really popular with her readership. They were largely Christian. It probably doesn't appeal so much today. And actually, it's interesting just to note in passing, though, that in terms of the sort of uptake of this way of thinking at the time, you find the very same reasoning in Anna Sewell's novel Black Beauty, where the horses discuss, you know, the way that they're treated by human beings. And the horses tend to take the view, you know, God made us to be happy. And, you know, these terrible humans are kind of you know, abusing us and forcing all these things on us that God never intended. So it was a common view at the time, but still it might come as a bit of a surprise, because you might think, well, hasn't the mainstream Christian view been that animals don't have souls and so they are incapable of salvation, unlike human beings? And what about the fact that God has given Adam dominion over the earth and the creatures of the earth? Now, Cobb did acknowledge this problem. So in a different essay, for instance, she commented, "The present benevolent Pope answered a few years ago the request to found a society for prevention of cruelty to animals in Rome by the response that such an association could not be sanctioned, being founded on a theological error, to wit that Christians owed any duties to animals," says Cobb. But nonetheless, she still thought that we can distinguish between true Christianity and institutionalized Christendom, and that true Christianity does provide the resources for recognizing our moral responsibilities to animals. So her way generally of kind of getting a true core of Christianity was to say that we've got to just start from the kind of axiom that God is good, and then we reconstruct everything else on that basis and eliminate all the other elements of Christianity and historical inheritances that conflict with that. And so we can filter out this sort of moral essence of Christianity, which includes the idea that God has made the animals capable of flourishing and having a good, happy life. How do these three arguments fit together? The one possibility is that they're just independent, that they're meant to kind of try to catch different readers from different places. We might even wonder whether they conflict, because the comparative argument has it that Europeans are falling behind other world civilizations, such as the Islamic world. But that seems perhaps in tension with Cobb's defense of Christianity as being the starting point for our duties to animals. And at the same time, her philosophical argument seems to just provide a rational case for duties to animals that doesn't refer to any religious factors at all. But I suggest that there is a way that the three fit together. So I think Cobb believes that what is common to Islam at its best and Christianity at its best, and indeed all of the world religions at their best, that they have in common the idea of a kind of divine moral source from which comes our duty to animals and the duty to increase their happiness and reduce their suffering. And this general idea of a sort of divine source of moral requirements, she thought of as common to all of the world religions. And crucially for her, the divine source of requirements it's transcendent. So it's beyond the given social world and its institutions and its political arrangements, which means that we can have duties to animals that come from God and they hold independently of the social order. And they're still there, even if society doesn't recognize them at all. Now, then these connect up with her philosophical argument, because ultimately for her, the duty of benevolence has a religious basis. So she says that the duty that we have to increase the happiness, reduce the unhappiness of all sentient beings, it's intuitive for her. We know it intuitively. We don't kind of extrapolate from any empirical observations. It's prior to observations. But intuition, she says, is God's tuition. So our most basic moral intuitions come to us from God, and we have these intuitions. God has made sure that we have them in order to ensure that we all sort of have the makeup to kind of act in accordance with morality, at least if we pay attention to our intuitions. We might not. So she thought science was encouraging people to ignore their intuitions, but the intuitions are still there for her. Okay, so I've mentioned the fact that Cobb completely rejected the idea that Darwin's belief in human continuity with animals was a positive thing in terms of the treatment of animals. Because people often say this, she disagreed. So, for example, Peter Singer in Animal Liberation, that's kind of, you know, the Bible of animal ethics in a way, for better or worse. But he kind of sees Darwin as this key forerunner because Darwin undermines human exceptionalism, he undermines anthropocentrism. So Singer has this very celebratory portrayal of Darwin. And as a historical view, it is very doubtful because of this dispute between Cobb and Darwin, which I'll now tell you about. So having begun to work out her views on animal ethics, Cobb began to campaign for legal regulation. And this went on over years and years. She gathered all these supporters, some, you know, lots of powerful and influential people. And then she drafted a proposed piece of legislation in 1875, which was presented by her allies in Parliament. And the proposal was that vivisections should be allowed to take place only in registered premises, and there had to be regular inspections. Lay people, as opposed to scientists, had to be included among the inspectors, and that all experiments had to use anesthetics, except you had to apply for a limited license if you wanted to do without anesthetics. So in essence, vivisection was to take place, it was to be transparent to the public, and the public was to be involved. And just as an aside, it's obviously quite an interesting thing because all of this is about the Victorian period. But, you know, here we have a woman sort of drafting a piece of legislation. She couldn't be in Parliament herself to present it, but, you know, she was the driving force behind it all the same. So then the scientific community got together to oppose this proposal, and at the head of the opponents was Darwin. So up until this point, roughly, Cobb and Darwin had been friends, quite good friends, but they began to fall out about this. So Darwin and some others were the central figures in putting forward a rival, weaker piece of legislation, basically to have no scrutiny at all unless scientists declared that the experiments they were doing were painful, in which case they had to get a license. So in a way, they weren't saying that there should be no, they weren't saying there should be no scrutiny at all, but they did want sort of a very light touch sort of system. And in particular, they did not want lay people to be scrutinizing scientists. That, above all, was actually the stumbling block, because they thought that lay people couldn't understand the potential medical benefits or the scientific issues, and they would just sort of think, you know, these people are being mean to a dog, you know, shut it down. So that's sort of how they saw it. Now, Cobb was not happy about their proposal. She said that under their system, all scientists had to do was to declare that they were using anesthetics, and that was it. Darwin said, well, that's all that's needed, because he insisted that most scientists were treating animals as humanely as they could, and they didn't need to be being constantly investigated. It would only stifle vital research. Whereas Cobb was more skeptical, and she thought scientists couldn't be trusted and there had to be regulation and the threat of punishment. So in an odd way, it was partly that Darwin was more optimistic about scientists and Cobb was more pessimistic. So anyway, they had these rival proposals. Parliament responded by having a royal commission, and they, in the end, came out with a compromise, which was the first piece of legislation ever in the world to regulate the scientific use of animals. So this was this 1876 Cruelty to Animals Act, which Cobb said was rightly named. So what the compromise involved was that painful experiments required you to get a license, and you had to use anesthetics unless this would defeat the purpose of what you were doing. And the licensing committee was composed of scientists. So you can see how it was a bit of a mixture of the two. And consequently, it satisfied neither. So as Darwin saw it, the law was Cobb's law. But as Cobb saw it, the law was Darwin's law. So, yeah, so nobody was happy. And she was horrified. So she said, basically, she said, my hopes had been raised so high to be dashed so low as to make me fear that I'd done harm instead of good, and brought fresh danger to the brutes for whose sake, as I realized more and more of their agonies, I would have gladly died. So she was absolutely horrified. She thought that scientists could now ratify one another's activities. So it was not only the continuation of what had already been going on, but now it had the seal of kind of legal approval and political approval as well. And she thought that it was significant that it was Darwin and his followers who were behind this. So she says that the disciples of Darwin should themselves be the teachers and leaders in a new form of cruelty to the brutes, whom they believe to share our blood, our intelligence, and our affections. This is indeed a portent of strange and threatening augury, as she puts it, so sort of ominous. And what it reveals for her is that when we level human beings down to a species of animal, we take away the idea that we are moral agents and we stand under requirements laid down by God. Instead, we become just another part of the physical world operating under natural laws like other animals. And so there's no space for any kind of transcendent moral requirements. And we're legitimized in doing whatever is in our immediate self-interest or the interest of our species. And so as she puts it, Darwinism involves a moral theory of boundless application, that the weak have no claims at all against the strong, but may be tortured ad infinitum on the chance of discovering something interesting to the lordlier race. So she's basically saying with Darwinism, it's the survival of the fittest. And, you know, if humans need to survive by harming animals, so be it. So I suspect that Cobb would have been surprised to see Peter Singer celebrating Darwin as the precursor of animal ethics. But of course, it is hard for him to recognize women who were the forerunners of animal ethics, because the women have been left out of the philosophical canon. And Cobb is not an isolated case here. So even within her own period and place, there were many other women who also wrote about animal ethics. And this is where I'm going to just squeeze in a little bit about two of the others. So Anna Kingsford, she was probably the best known animal welfare thinker after Cobb herself. And she is a really fascinating figure. So she had been concerned about animals from when she was quite young. And then her interest really crystallized when she was editing a journal, and Cobb sent in a contribution to the journal about animal experimentation, which Kingsford hadn't really been aware of as an issue before. And so after that, she became a vegetarian, she became an anti-vivisectionist. She tried as far as she could to avoid every form of use and exploitation of animals. So she had specially made clothing, specially made shoes. She wasn't a vegan, however, but yeah, I mean, I think that was probably just impossible. She actually embarked on a medical degree. This was in 1873. And she studied in Paris because at the time in Britain, women weren't allowed to study medicine. And she was determined to prove that it was possible to be a scientific expert and a medical doctor without having to experiment on animals. And in fact, she produced a dissertation with which she graduated about vegetarianism. The English translation was The Perfect Way in Diet. And she argued for vegetarianism on a whole range of grounds, sort of spiritual, but also physical health, economic case in terms of land use, sort of every possible reason. So she began, as well as being a practicing doctor for women, of course, she delivered a huge number of public lectures advocating animal welfare, opposing vivisection. One of the central arguments she made against vivisection was to say that it was useless because she thought humans are so different in structure and function from other species that animal tests were utterly unreliable, which is still an argument that is made today. Opponents of animal experimentation will often point out that the majority of animal tests, the results turn out not to transfer to human beings. Well, of course, the tricky case is, well, what about the few where they do transfer? But still, despite the fact that it was Cobb who had first pushed Kingsford in this direction, they then fell out. And this is because Cobb was actually against vegetarianism, which may come as a total surprise. As she said about this, the animals we use for food exist on the condition that we shall take their lives when we need them. And in doing so, in the ordinary, not unmerciful manner, we save them the far worse miseries of old age and starvation. And this is a beneficent scheme of creation. Now, of course, some might say here, well, hang on, can't we say the animals we use in experiments exist on the condition? But she did not think that the cases were symmetrical. So if we think back to her distinction as I put it, between our needs and our desires, she would have thought that we need to eat meat. I mean, there were vegetarians in Britain at the time, such as Kingsford. Kingsford was kind of the leader, but they were tiny. They were really tiny. So even by 1900, the Vegetarian Society had only 4,000 members. So there was not a lot of evidence that you could healthily be a vegetarian at the time. And of course, it was before intensive farming. So I think you can see why she thought animal experimentation and eating meat were different cases, that they weren't similar to one another. Whereas Kingsford thought they were. She thought they were sort of exactly parallel, and that to be consistent, you had to, if you opposed animal experimentation, you also had to oppose the eating of meat. So in turn, Kingsford persuaded another, at the time, influential female intellectual, Annie Besant. Kingsford persuaded her to become an anti-vivisectionist as well. Now, Besant's views are interesting. Initially, she defended vivisection on utilitarian grounds explicitly. So she said that animal experimentation would lead to cures for diseases and that it would bring net benefits to animals, in fact, as well as humans. It would bring about a preponderance of pleasure over pain. And of course, this is also a defense that you often hear. And it was pointed out by others at the time, sort of similarly to Besant, look, some of the beneficiaries of these animal experiments are going to be animals. Like, you know, with the experiments on cattle that led to the development of the vaccine against anthrax, the main beneficiaries were actually animals. So anyway, Besant defended vivisection on these grounds, and Kingsford wrote back to her. It was an exchange of letters that was published in a magazine called the National Reformer. And one of the things Kingsford said against Besant was that her utilitarian reasoning was sufficient to justify experiments on humans. You know, why not sacrifice 10 children for the sake of the millions who will benefit from some vaccine? And this actually led Besant to change her mind. And she said in her autobiography, I was misled by very partial knowledge of the nature of the experiments performed, and by my fear that if scientific men were forbidden to experiment on animals, they would perforce experiment with them on the poor in hospitals. So basically, she was saying she had been in favor of vivisection on the grounds that we need to use animals in order to protect humans. Kingsford had replied that the utilitarian defense of vivisection would inevitably legitimize experiments on humans. And so you can see why that then led Besant to kind of completely change her mind and think, oh, yeah, okay, actually experimenting on animals creates a case for experimenting on humans rather than protecting against experimenting on humans. And they should mention that her worry, you know, about experiments on the poor, there were experiments, you know, that were done on poor people. And in fact, there was a whole hospital in London that was established. I can't remember its name, but it was like the kind of non-vivisection hospital, which basically lots of poor and working class people started to go to because they felt that they would be safe there from the risk of being experimented upon. So one of the final things I want to point out as quite interesting is that in her defense of animals, Kingsford appealed to a Buddhist version of the idea of rebirth. And so she said, our souls have existed in animal bodies before, and animals have souls that will go on to be re-embodied as humans, so that we're all interconnected in that way. And in fact, she says all creatures represent incarnations of one and the same universal soul, and animals are the preliminary to humanity. So she's still got the sort of idea that the soul starts off embodied in an animal and then it will progress to being embodied in a human. But that we're all interconnected and there's no absolute human-animal divide, so different from Cobb on that point. And therefore, anything that a human being is entitled to by virtue of having a soul, animals are entitled to as well for her. And once Besant had turned towards animal welfare, she also began to look at ideas about rebirth. Now, this is complicated in Besant's case by her whole intellectual journey. So Besant got into this alternative religion, theosophy, and the idea within theosophy was that there's a higher spiritual wisdom available within the religion and philosophy of India than in the West. And this motivated Besant actually to move to India. This is by now in 1893, and she immersed herself in the study of the Hindu scriptures. She translated parts of the Bhagavad Gita. She collaborated on textbooks of Hindu philosophy with an Indian philosopher called Bhagavan Das. So, you know, one part of me feels it was like she was sort of doing decolonization a long time in advance. But then you also might say, British woman producing textbooks on Indian philosophy for Indian readers is maybe the height of colonialism as well. That as part of this, she took on the idea of reincarnation, and she also took an ethics where the highest virtue is to do no harm, for which reason she said we have no right to cause animal suffering and terror merely for the gratification of the palate. But what's interesting to me is that to different degrees, all of Kingsford, Besant and Cobb, they all turned to non-Western traditions. I mean, Besant the most, Kingsford did so as well. Cobb remained pretty firmly within Christianity, but nonetheless, you know, her very first essay about animal ethics begins by contrasting modern Europe with the Islamic world. So they all, I think, were looking for a way to kind of, to sort of find alternative traditions that could back up the moral standards for treating animals that they wanted, because they felt that they couldn't get the case from within a European world where science was taking off and animal experimentation was becoming normalized. And so they wanted to look to somewhere sort of outside, I think, to find some alternative standards. But one of the interesting things then that I want to conclude with is that if we re-include them in the history of philosophy, we not only get more women, but then we also begin to get this interesting conversation between European and non-European philosophical traditions as well. I will stop there. Thank you for listening.
So thank you very much. I think the microphone is open for all the questions you might have.
So I actually have to leave in like 5 minutes. So mine, it's more a comment than a question, but I will also ask you a question and then maybe you can discuss without me. So first of all, thank you so much. I think this reintroduction of this figure in the history of political philosophy, it's also, I think, very interesting to complicate a bit the history of animal ethics and animal rights, as you shown with the idea of Darwin being not this champion of the animal rights as we imagine he could be. And I think this is also interesting, and this is the question mostly. Does this women address this topic in any place by referring to their experience as women in their relation with science and scientific method? Because when you were talking about Cobb criticizing the proposal, the proposal of the law, and also the actual law that then passes, with this idea that scientists, the debating with scientists, will allow other scientists to do what they want, for me was interesting coming from a woman that was excluded from, for instance, scientific societies and scientific debates. So she was part of this debate, but of course, for instance, she could not present the law in the parliament. So it's an inclusion that it's also an exclusion. And I think that this is very relevant. Also, I've studied a lot Wollstonecraft, coming from the satirical piece that Thomas Taylor presented after Wollstonecraft published The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, that was titled The Vindication of the Rights of Brutes. And the claim was, if women starts to claim the rights, then animals will claim rights too. And in some sense, even if it's not explicit in the text that you presented, it reminds me of this kind of critique, but at the same time that it's also a very productive way of thinking of the intersection between animals and women's rights or ethics. So, but thank you.
Oh, so, okay. I wasn't sure whether I should be waiting to, yeah. Thank you. I had not thought about that connection with that sort of post-Wollstonecraft. But yes, I mean, that must be kind of in the background of all this. So they did very much make a connection between scientific treatment of animals and men's treatment of women. And in the case of Cobb particularly, so she also, one of the things she also campaigned about was male violence towards women. And again, she wanted legislative change, and she did this essay called Wife Torture in England, which had quite an impact, and that included her proposals for legislative change, which went through. But she thought, I mean, this gets a bit complex, but she basically thought that just as Darwinism, it was kind of eroding moral limits, and sort of ancient impulses of cruelty were kind of coming out, and with the erosion of all the things that might make us sort of restrain ourselves. And so these impulses were finding an outlet, and she thought that the same impulses were manifest in lots of cases of male violence towards women and towards their wives. So she talks about how I mean, she talked about lots of real cases, but she sort of thought the scenario was that a husband would hit his wife, and seeing her crying and sobbing, rather than him feeling sympathy, he would then feel what she called heteropathy, like the opposite of sympathy, that he would be kind of enraged and sort of be even more violent in a kind of cycle. So she absolutely thought that there was a parallel between these two things. Yeah, although one thing that for her isn't quite parallel about them is that she thought that male violence towards women, she acknowledged it did occur amongst the well-off people, but she thought it was more of a problem amongst working people. Whereas with animal experimentation, she was very explicit. This is being done by the elite, by the scientific elite. And she thought in a way that made it worse than things like, you know, a taxi driver kind of whipping their horse, because she thought that the bourgeoisie kind of had no excuse for what they were doing. So she was also quite aware with this critique of vivisection, you know, that she was kind of attacking the elite, really. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a lot of questions I would like to ask, but I will limit myself. So I found, first of all, a little reflection. I really loved your presentation on Cobb and how she developed this relationship between humans and nature, in the sense that she tries to find a balance between a mere anthropocentrism and, on the other part, she denies the idea that we are animals as all the others. And I think it's really useful for the actual debate in environmental philosophy and the ecology, because there is this streaming by Timothy Martin and all the others that says that humans are animals among many others, so we don't play a role. And I think it's problematic because it takes out the responsibility we have, and it masks the role of morality, but also society, capitalism, history, that plays a role in our relationship with nature. So we have to accept the fact that we are animals, but we are peculiar in a way. So we have to be responsible of this peculiarity. And I think in the actual debate, there is this problem because we want to say so much we are not the center of nature that we forget we have a responsibility. Cobb says morality, we can say history, we can say society, economy, and all the other things. So I would like if you have some thoughts about it. And a second point, but it's really a question about curiosity, I would like to ask if aesthetics plays a role in all these things, because in Germany, in the same years, the relation, a more moral or a more effective relationship with nature, a empathy with animals, with nature, in this new sensibility, beauty played a main role. So we can say that nature is beautiful. So we have to respect the beauty we see in nature, the beauty we see in animals. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the second one, I'm gonna sort of answer your second question first. There would be a similarity earlier in the British 19th century, sort of in the Romantic era, definitely. You know, with people like Coleridge, who, you know, he was a sort of major importer of German thought. Now, more recently, I've been looking at 19th century British women on aesthetics. And what's interesting is that for them, aesthetics is very much philosophy of art. So, yeah, it's very art-centered. But I had not thought about this connection with Cobb. There is a connection with her. So she sort of stands a bit apart from all the other people who were focused upon art by saying that art beauty always derives from the beauty of nature, and the beauty of nature, but that comes from God for her. So again, she sort of puts this religious basis to it. And I hadn't actually thought about the connection between those parts of her philosophy, but yeah, now that you've kind of prompted me to think of it, I would definitely say, yeah, they are connected in that way. But most often, people seem to have really focused on art. Yeah, so your first question was about kind of the contemporary debate and the difficulty of sort of how to hold on to the idea that we have a moral responsibility. Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, one way that I think people might often want to go is to sort of say that, you know, there's maybe the beginnings of kind of moral and normative behavior amongst animals too. So that we sort of say that what we've got is kind of just the further elaboration. And then what animals are doing is, you know, or what mammals are doing is the further elaboration of sort of other types of animals and so on. So I suppose that would be the kind of the alternative way to go without, you know, because Cobb very much sort of wants there to be a line. But I think there's probably ways, you know, that you can kind of push Cobb sort of more towards, or just kind of take it saying, look, the challenge is how are you going to recognize our moral responsibility? Yeah. And I mean, maybe we can do it by saying it's an elaboration of things animals already do. Maybe. Yeah. I mean, I'll ask you what you think about that later. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting. And I was thinking that really this important work that you're doing of going a little bit away from the canon, as we were saying before, and uncovering these important thinkers, at least on me, has the effect of thinking that this is like the road not taken, more or less, you know, in many respects, because you could have a different kind of science, a different kind of treatment of animals, maybe a different kind of, how do you say, modern contemporary society to some extent, because, well, one of the arguments that today is used against this human superiority or whatever is that, you know, we're too anthropocentric, and we should realize that we're not the center of, but since we are in fact the center of the world because of the impact that we have on the world, this gives us also moral responsibility So I think these reflections are really interesting, especially in the relationship with Darwin. I just wanted to go back, if you could go to the Besant quote when she was that she said, "I was misled by very partial knowledge of the nature of the experiments performed, and by my fear that if scientific men were forbidden to experiment on animals with drugs, they would perforce experiment with them on the poor in hospitals." So this is like really sort of a woman's moral responsibility, even greater, because she knows that men, scientific men, can do even worse. So I think it's very interesting. They take on themselves the responsibility to limit the, what scientific man, what science can do in the name of progress or whatever it is. So I think it's very, very interesting also in relation to this idea of moral responsibility. So this was just a comment, but I know this is like my comment could sound essentialist to some extent, but this duty of benevolence, isn't this something that it sort of comes more natural to women or not? Because I tend to think it not more natural or more immediate. I don't know. Very
Absolutely.
essential.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Okay, so there's several questions there. Yes, about the road not taken. I know it's quite sad, really, in that way. Yes, absolutely. Them taking on this responsibility as women, yeah. But I guess this goes back to a bit to Carlotta's comments as well, because I think this is a bit where the Victorian gender ideology kind of sort of subverts itself, because, the idea was that as women, they had to be morally pure, higher expectations in terms of virtue, that they must be doing their duty at all times. And I guess the ideology was for women to be doing that in the home, but it kind of inevitably spilled over, because it's like, well, if it's my duty to, to spread benevolence and to increase happiness, it can't possibly be my duty to confine that to my own immediate family. And hence you get sort of someone like Cobb, leading the animal welfare movement, or, you've got Florence Nightingale, is where the ideology of duty kind of then, leads all these women to sort of think it's their sort of public responsibility to kind of do their duty on a wider scale. And there's an author called Diana Donald. She's written a really interesting book called Women Against Cruelty. And she kind of talks about how, especially by later in the century, you had this gender divide with sort of the Victorian men who were, in a constant round of hunting, or they were kind of going to the colonies where they were kind of, also hunting and sort of, imposing British rule upon all these other people. So you had kind of, the men were doing that, while the women were sort of concerned about, nursing and hospital reform and animal welfare, and indeed, women's rights. Sort of this real sort of moral divide. So duty of benevolence, does it come more naturally to women? I mean, I think what I've just been saying about that divide, it kind of suggests, at least at that time, it did, you know, and maybe sort of through the legacy of that, you know, maybe it still does. And as to what Cobb would have thought about this, so she basically thought that the seeds of sympathy and benevolence were in the relationship between mother and child, you know, and then it had to be extended from there. So she certainly did take the view that this comes more naturally to women. I don't know. Yeah.
Or at least my position would be that it would come natural to both gender, or women and men, except that men have been prevented from through a certain type of education and culture. So this is the closest I can get to. But it's very interesting what you just said, this Victorian gender ideology that subverts itself. I think it's a very convincing and convincing way of looking at this, what you're working on. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It was very inspiring. I was really impressed by well, my English vocabulary fails me here. I think it's more sophisticated, deeper take on animal ethics that I see in Cobb. Well, I'm not surprised that is way deeper, more sensitive than Darwin. But it reminded me of the way Cora Diamond view on ethics is way higher, deeper than Peter Singer. And I wanted to make sense of this parallel and see what you think about it. Well, the way I understand Cobb's position is along the Kantian line. Let's put it this way. When we take the moral point of view, we kind of get access to this kingdom of ends where respect rules unconditionally, and you have a sense of a value that is higher than any kind of desire. So, and that seems to change everything in your attitude towards the whole experience, yeah? But then Cora Diamond says something along these lines. So this is much more than the difficulty of philosophy. It's a difficult that you have to handle with a range of tools that are not just intellectual means. So you need emotion, stories, poetry, and that is how I understand this duty of benevolence. It's not just a matter of finding the right kind of philosophical solution to this riddle, but to find a wide range, broad range of, this feelings and stories and even poetry or, yes, and there always a sense of tragedy there. So the idea that you are, yes, you are a member of the kingdom events, but not in your life 24 hours a day life. So that sense of, so the duty of benevolence comes also from this experience. And I find this attitude in Cora Diamond, and well, if I have to just, yes, mention one philosopher today, but I also sense something similar in Cobb's way of handling these.
Yeah,
the
thank
second
you.
tab.
I must look again at Cora Diamond, and yeah, it's reminding me of, you know, that when she talks about the sort of defeat, or she saw it, the legislative defeat, and sort of the agony of all the animal suffering that she identified with. But yeah, she was, so she would have said that Kant was her biggest philosophical influence, absolutely. And so it is particularly that idea that you have to do what's right, sort of irrespective of, you know, consequences for yourself or others, irrespective of your interests. Yeah, so it's that idea of disinterestedness that seems to have really, you know, engaged her above all with Kant. She disagrees with him about animals, of course, because, you know, she thinks we do have duties to animals, even though the duties to humans come first. But in terms of what you're saying as well about the need to kind of sort of broaden the moral sources that we have, and, you know, feelings and literature, she came to think that her early work that I've talked about, that it was still too rationalist. So she came to give sympathy sort of more and more importance, kind of the feeling of sympathy, and to think that the central thing, if you were experimenting on an animal, was that you had to kind of stifle your feelings, you know, that you would spontaneously have a feeling of sympathy for the suffering animal, and that you had to kind of train yourself not to feel it. So she came to think of it as wrong, sort of above all, in the sense that it involved kind of cultivating the wrong feelings towards animals. And if we cultivated the right feelings towards animals, then we would act towards them in the right sort of way, and we wouldn't need sort of such a codification of things, because we'd have the feelings. So she did shift there. And yes, she thought, yeah, she certainly thought of literature, that poetry and so on, that these could cultivate the right sorts of feelings for animals and sympathy for animals. Although she also, so one of her books is called False Beasts and True, and she talks there about various ways she thinks literature has kind of misrepresented animals, that she thinks the different animal species tend to be sort of seen as having a kind of a fixed character, and that the characters aren't always correct. So then she kind of critiques some of what she thinks of as these misrepresentations, kind of against her own observations of animals. It's interesting. So this is where, for instance, of rabbits, she says that they are represented as being, as sort of personifying fear, you know, and she says not at all. If you look in a field, it's the evening, if there's no predators around, there they are, the rabbits, you know, they're leaping around, they're happy, they're able to kind of, you know, enjoy life. It's not like they're kind of bowed down by fear all the time. And so she sort of says similar things about the others. So she would say literature, you know, it can help, but it can also kind of have these essentialist views of animals, and kind of using them to sort of symbolize human qualities. And yeah.
Very short side comment. I don't know if it sounds so strange to you as it sounds to me, a duty of benevolence. You cannot have a duty of benevolence from a Kantian attitude towards morality. But it seems, well, I think that Cora Diamonds has precisely this sense that if you want to handle the complexity, the moral complexity of our relationship to animals, you need that sort of paradoxical duty, combining, yes, a Kantian moral point of view and the attitude of sympathy, of course, that you find in utilitarianism. So that's seems impossible. So that's why this kind of difficulty is harder than the difficulty of philosophy. Yeah, that's the sort of insight that I get from your presentation of Cobb's position is that is why it's so appealing to me, that it's so respectful of that sort of moral complexity that you discover when you where you sincerely come to grips with the problems of being together with animals in this planet. Yeah. So thank you very much.
That's really interesting. So I mean, it's definitely go back to Cora Diamond. Yeah, because similarly, you know, so although, as I say, Kant was Cobb's biggest influence, you know, but it's not kind of, although the interesting thing is that at the time, everyone just seemed to accept, you know, Cobb's a Kantian. But I think it's maybe just that Cobb was not sort of all that well understood still. Yeah. So I think of her, yeah, it's kind of a halfway between utilitarianism and Kantianism in a way with this, plus with the theism as well. Yeah, yeah. And so again, she kind of undersells herself, because in some of her works, she says that she's just a popularizer of Kant, and that she's kind of merely disseminating his ideas. But, you know, it's clearly much more sort of an original combination of views than she advertised.
Okay, so may I add a final comment, saying that there are no other questions related to this final point on Kant and so on. I was quite impressed this expression by Cobb in one of the first quotation. She said, the awful gift of freedom, which is not Kantian, not at all. So my suggestion would be that this is a kind of deontologism, philosophy of duty, but seeing the emphasis on the transcendent dimension of it, and also some references to religious traditions, is more in this line than in the Kantian one. But
absolutely, yeah. Well, when I was doing a podcast with someone recently, and actually they said the same thing as you, and they said, look, doesn't Cobb actually have a heteronymous ethics, because, you know, it's coming from God, so that, you know, in a way it then begins to seem sort of very far from Kant altogether. And again, this is the funny thing, though, that at the time, you know, people didn't, they didn't sort of say that. They seem to have just kind of taken it, yeah, that this is a Kantian view. But yeah, absolutely, it's very different. Yeah.